Unmasking the Killer, the Andrea Del Vesco murder mystery true crime documentary. The room was cold. Too cold. Andrea Del Vesco had always been meticulous. Her apartment, an oasis of pristine order, felt like a museum. Nothing was out of place, not even the slightest wrinkle on the couch cushions. But tonight, something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy, her breathing shallow. She walked through the dark hallway, her bare feet whispering against the hardwood floor. The kitchen light flickered. Once, twice, it stopped. Andrea paused. Her reflection in the darkened window caught her eye. Her face was pale. Sweat beaded on her forehead. She felt watched. Her pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text message. It was from an unknown number. "Look behind you." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She spun around. Nothing. But the silence, it felt suffocating. She strained her ears. The faintest sound, footsteps, echoed from the hallway. Slow, measured. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She reached for the knife block on the counter. Her fingers trembled. With one swift motion, she drew the largest blade. Her body tensed. The footsteps grew louder. Closer, closer. Then, suddenly nothing. Complete silence. Her heart raced in her chest. A sudden crash from the living room made her jump. Her breath caught. She hesitated. She couldn't run. Not now. Not after everything. The footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, coming toward her. Her grip tightened on the knife. Her body moved forward. Her eyes scanned every shadow in the room. And then, a figure emerged from the dark. A face she never expected to see. A face that should have been long gone. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. It only stepped closer. The blade glinted in the dim light. Her hand shook. And just like that, it was over. The cold returned. This time it stayed. The room was silent. The stillness hung like a suffocating fog. Andrea's lifeless body crumpled to the floor, her limbs limp. Her once vibrant eyes were dull, vacant. The only sound now was the distant hum of the city outside. The flickering kitchen light, still casting eerie shadows, bathed the scene in a cold, unnatural glow. The figure stood over her, watching, waiting. They didn't rush. There's no need. The deed was done, but something lingered in the air. A question, a whisper that hadn't been answered. Who? The apartment remained sealed in a quiet, eerie stillness. The city outside continued its relentless pulse, unaware of the dark history unfolding just beyond its glimmering skyline. The police gave up on the case. Theories faded. Speculations dissolved into whispers, fading into the background of everyday life. But someone was watching. Someone always was. Months went by, and Andrea's death became a footnote in the news cycle, her name slipping from memory like water through fingers. Her friends, those few who had known her, mourned quietly, never quite understanding what had happened, but accepting that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. The unanswered question hung like a shadow over their lives. Who could have done this, and why? But then, one night, something changed. A new lead, a break in the case, a single photograph discovered in an old file. A blurry image, grainy, hard to make out, but unmistakable. It was taken just outside Andrea's apartment, weeks before her death. The figure in the photo was barely visible, cloaked in darkness, but their silhouette was unmistakable. A familiar figure, a face that seemed to haunt Andrea's past. Someone who had been close to her. Someone she trusted. The name attached to the photo sent chills through the detectives working the case. It was a name they hadn't heard in years. A name that shouldn't have resurfaced. A name that made their blood run cold. Andrea's ex-fiancé, Julian Hale. He had disappeared from the public eye after a tumultuous breakup with Andrea. Unexplained, sudden. He had always been a mystery, and now it seemed he had returned, not just to haunt Andrea, but to kill her. The investigation resumed with a new urgency. Julian Hale was no longer a ghost. He was real, and he was dangerous. Every lead they chased pointed back to him. To his obsession with Andrea, his jealousy, his hatred. He was a man who couldn't let go. A man who would do anything to erase her from the world. Andrea's death wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much darker truth. The investigation picked up speed, but the clock was ticking. Julian Hale was elusive. He had disappeared without a trace after Andrea's death, vanishing into the underworld he knew so well. But the detectives weren't giving up. They dug into his past, his history with Andrea, his troubled mind, his possessiveness. It became clear that Julian's obsession had never truly faded. He had always been the kind of man who would stalk his prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Andrea had been his obsession for years. Their relationship had been toxic, filled with manipulation, control, and lies. She had left him, but Julian had never accepted it. The more they uncovered, the darker the picture became. It wasn't just jealousy or heartbreak. It was a dangerous obsession that spiraled into something far worse. The detectives finally tracked down a lead, an address, an old hideout in the outskirts of the city. It was a crumbling, abandoned warehouse, tucked away in a forgotten corner. The air smelled of decay, and the walls were lined with remnants of Julian's past, notes, photographs, and maps. Maps of Andrea's life, of her movements, her routines, her secrets. Everything about her had been meticulously catalogued. The detectives found evidence of his twisted fixation. Journals filled with rambling thoughts, scribbled in the margins with an almost feverish intensity. Julian had been planning Andrea's death long before the night it actually happened. The chilling truth hit them like a freight train. Andrea wasn't just murdered. She was hunted. He had been watching her for weeks, perhaps longer, tracking her every move, learning her habits, her vulnerabilities. Julian had known exactly when and where to strike. He had waited until she was alone, until she felt safe, and then he had taken her. The realization was suffocating. Andrea had never stood a chance, but there was no sign of Julian now. No clues to where he had gone, no trace of his whereabouts. He had vanished once again, like smoke in the wind. The investigation had reached another dead end, but the detectives knew one thing for certain. Julian Hale was still out there, and wherever he wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. He had a plan, a darker, more terrifying plan, and the only thing they could do now was wait for him to make the next move. But deep down, they knew this was far from over. In the shadows, Julian was watching, and Andrea's death wasn't the last. Weeks turned into months, and the trail grew colder. The city moved on, as it always did. Life resumed its usual rhythm. People came and went, oblivious to the dark shadow that still lingered. But for those who had been close to Andrea, the pain was unrelenting. Her friends, her colleagues, her family, they still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Andrea's death had never felt like an accident. It wasn't a random crime. It was personal. And Julian Hale, the man who had vanished, was never far from their thoughts. The detectives working the case knew the truth. They were just waiting for him to make the next move. And one evening, it finally came. It was a quiet, uneventful Thursday. Nothing unusual at first. Detective Maria Alvarez was alone in her office, staring at the evidence board covered with photographs, notes, and maps. She had spent countless hours piecing together Andrea's final days. But tonight, something felt different. Her phone rang, the sudden sound jolting her from her thoughts. It was an unlisted number. Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, and then, against her better judgment, she answered. "Detective Alvarez," a voice rasped on the other end. The voice was low, almost unrecognizable, but she knew immediately. It was him, Julian Hale. "Are you still looking for me?" he asked, his tone eerily calm. Maria's blood ran cold. "You're not going to find me," he continued. "But you'll never stop looking, will you?" His words were laced with a twisted amusement, as if he were toying with her. "Why did you kill her?" Maria asked, her voice trembling, but she didn't let him hear the fear. There was a long pause on the line. Then Julian spoke again, quieter this time. "She was always mine, and I always finish what I start." The line went dead. Maria sat frozen, her hands shaking. She knew now. Julian hadn't just been obsessed with Andrea. He had been consumed by her. His obsession had twisted into a need to possess, to control, to eliminate anyone who could stand in his way. And now he was daring them to chase him. He was daring them to come closer. But this time, Maria wasn't going to let him slip away. The investigation reignited, but they were no closer to finding him. The city had forgotten Andrea Del Vesco's name, but Julian hadn't forgotten. He was still watching, still hunting, and this time he wouldn't let anyone stand in his way, not even Detective Alvarez. The darkness that had been sealed in that small apartment months ago was far from finished. It was only just beginning. The days following the phone call were a blur. Detective Alvarez couldn't shake the feeling that Julian was closer than ever before. His words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, "I always finish what I start." Asterisk. Maria knew she was no longer just hunting a murderer. She was chasing a ghost, a predator who knew how to stay hidden. But this time, Julian had made a mistake. He had revealed himself. A pattern started to emerge after that phone call. A string of strange occurrences, unsettling coincidences that tied back to Andrea's life. Julian was leaving signs, hidden clues, a trail almost deliberately laid out for them to follow. A photograph left at the scene of a random burglary. A strange message scrawled on a wall in an abandoned building, all pointing back to Andrea, to the very apartment where her life had ended. The detectives thought they were finally closing in on him. Maria had become obsessed with the case, poring over every detail, every scrap of information that could bring her closer to Julian. But as the days passed, it became clearer that Julian was playing a far deeper game. He wasn't just running from the law, he was provoking them, and every step they took toward him, he took one further away. Then, just when it seemed like the investigation was about to break wide open, Maria received another call. This time, the voice was unmistakable. "You've been chasing shadows, Maria," Julian said, his voice dripping with cold amusement. She stood in her office, staring out the window, her eyes scanning the city below. The phone was heavy in her hand, her heartbeat quickening. "Where are you?" she demanded. But Julian only laughed softly. "You'll find out soon enough." Maria felt a chill creep down her spine. Before she could respond, he hung up. It was too quiet in her office. Her mind was racing. She had to move fast. She immediately ordered a full search of all the places Julian had frequented, abandoned properties, old haunts, even some of the areas where Andrea had spent time. It wasn't long before they found something, a lead, buried deep in the last place they would have thought to look. A small, hidden room in the basement of an old building. Inside, on the walls, were dozens of photographs of Andrea, pictures taken at different moments of her life, her childhood, her teenage years, and even the last few months before her death. But it wasn't just Andrea's pictures that sent a shiver through Maria's bones. It was what was written underneath each photo. A confession, a twisted message, a date. The final picture at the very end of the room was different from the rest. It was a recent photograph of Andrea, taken just days before her death. And underneath it, written in bold, jagged letters. Asterisk this time, I will finish what I started. Asterisk. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The words, the images, they were all signs that Julian was still watching, still toying with them. But the worst part wasn't what was written on the walls. It was the final photograph, the one of Andrea, because now, staring back at Maria from that photo was something she hadn't noticed before. Julian, in the background, a shadow lurking just behind her, barely visible but unmistakable. And in that moment, Maria understood. Andrea hadn't been alone that night. She had known her killer, and it wasn't over. The game had changed, and Julian was about to make his next move. As Maria stared at the photograph, her mind raced. She couldn't stop him. Not now. Not when he was this close. She had to warn everyone, but she knew the truth now. The real horror wasn't just the killing. It was the fact that Julian was still out there, still waiting, still watching. And the worst part, Maria's heart pounded as she stood frozen in the dimly lit basement. The photograph of Andrea with Julian's shadow in the background was burned into her mind. It was too clear. Andrea had never stood a chance, and now Maria realized neither did she. Julian had been watching them all along, and worse still, he was playing them. The hunt had turned into a game, one that Maria had been unaware she was part of until now. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of the trance. She pulled it out quickly, her hands shaking. It was another message from an unknown number. Look behind you. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned instinctively, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Nothing. The empty space seemed to stretch on forever. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Was he here? She didn't wait to find out. Her heart racing, she bolted out of the basement and back into the street. The chill in the night air was biting, sharp against her skin, but the unease inside her was far worse. She had to get to the others. She couldn't be alone. Chaotic. Williams was there along with a handful of other officers, but something was wrong. They were all looking at a single screen, a grainy surveillance video from a nearby alley. It was a close-up of her car, and standing right next to it, just out of view of the camera, was Julian. The video flickered, distorted for a moment, then cleared. Maria's breath stopped. There he was, his face, pale and almost unrecognizable in the dim light. But his eyes, the way he looked directly into the camera, sent a chill crawling up her spine. He was taunting her. He knew she was watching. And then, as if on cue, the video cut out. The screen went black. She grabbed Williams by the arm, her voice urgent. We need to move. He's going to strike again. I can feel it. But Williams looked at her, his face pale. Maria, we've been watching him for weeks. He's been right under our noses the whole time. We thought we had him cornered. We've been looking in all the wrong places, she whispered, her eyes wide with the realization. He's not hiding. He's waiting for us to come to him. Before she could say anything else, her phone buzzed again. Another message. Come to me, Maria. I'm ready for you. The air seemed to freeze around her. Julian wasn't hiding anymore. He was waiting for her to come to him. Maria slammed the phone down, adrenaline flooding her veins. She turned to Williams, her voice shaking but resolute. We need to go now. They rushed out of the precinct and into the night, the city streets suddenly feeling like a maze, twisting and turning with no escape. The fear in Maria's chest had turned to something else now, a cold certainty. Julian had planned this from the very beginning, and he wanted her to find him, to be his final act. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their feet hitting the pavement, echoing through the empty streets. Then, as they reached a darkened intersection, a shadow moved just ahead. Maria stopped dead in her tracks. It was him. Julian, standing motionless in the center of the street, bathed in the dim glow of a street lamp. His face was calm, almost serene. Maria's breath hitched. He was waiting for them, for her. Williams reached for his gun, but Maria stopped him, her voice low and strained. Don't. He's not going to run. He wants this. The figure in front of them didn't move. His eyes locked onto hers. It was as if time had stopped. You've been playing my game, Maria, Julian said, his voice a low rasp that sent a shiver through her spine. And now you're ready for the final round. Maria's heart slammed in her chest. She had thought she understood him. But now, standing there in front of him, she realized how little she knew about the mind of a man who had turned obsession into a deadly art. His twisted amusement was all too clear now. But one thing was certain. This was it. The end. And Julian was ready for the final move. Maria stepped forward, every instinct telling her to flee. But she stayed rooted. This was it. She had no choice but to face him now. The game was over. Maria stepped forward, her mind racing, but her body betraying her. Every part of her screamed to run, to flee from the man who stood before her, as cold and unwavering as a statue. But there was no turning back now. Julian's eyes never left hers. His gaze was unervingly calm, almost predatory, like a spider watching its prey inch closer. Do you understand, Maria? His voice was smooth, too smooth. You've been chasing ghosts, hunting shadows, but none of it matters anymore. Maria's hand hovered over her holster, her fingers tingling, but she couldn't bring herself to draw her weapon. Not yet. He wanted her to react, to do something reckless. She needed to stay sharp, stay calm. Her throat felt dry, the words coming out hoarse. This is over, Julian. It's done. He chuckled low and guttural. No, Maria. This is just the beginning. He took a slow step forward, then another. Maria's pulse quickened. She could feel her legs growing heavier, her body pulling back against every instinct, but she couldn't break her gaze from his. He was right there, so close now she could almost touch him, and yet there was something strange, something off about the way he moved. It was almost like he was waiting for her to make the next move, for her to make a mistake. You really thought you could stop me? Julian said, his voice low and mocking. You never understood, did you? It wasn't about Andrea. It wasn't about me. It was about you. The words cut through her like a knife. She couldn't respond. She couldn't speak. The realization hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. This wasn't just about Andrea's death. This was about him breaking her. Maria's grip tightened on her gun, her whole body tense with the effort to control her shaking hands. Get back, Williams finally ordered, his voice tight with fear. But Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Williams. He was entirely focused on Maria. He took another step, then another. Maria's breath caught in her throat. And then, the sound of a sharp click broke through the air. Julian's eyes flicked briefly to the side. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she realized what it was. A gunshot. A muffled, distant sound. It wasn't from her side. It wasn't from Julian. The streetlight overhead flickered, and then went out, plunging the scene into complete darkness. The air grew thick, as if something terrible were about to happen. Then Maria heard it. A voice. Low. Almost a whisper. Maria. She whipped around, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The street was empty. There was no one. No one except her and Julian. But the whisper, it was there, like a breath against her ear. A chill shot down her spine. Her body stiffened, all her senses now razor-sharp. And that's when she saw it, his eyes. Not the calm, collected gaze from before. Something had changed. His eyes were wide now, frantic, almost desperate. For the first time, Julian seemed unsure. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered, his voice barely audible, cracking under the pressure. "You weren't supposed to find me." His composure was slipping. Maria didn't wait for another word. In one fluid motion, she drew her weapon. But before she could take aim, Julian collapsed to his knees, his face contorted in agony. "What's happening?" Maria whispered, her heart racing, her hand trembling, the gun still trained on him. He looked up at her, his face pale, the color draining from his skin. "It's not over, Maria. It's never over," he gasped. But then his eyes fluttered. His body went limp. Julian Hale collapsed onto the pavement, and just like that, it was over. Maria's mind spun as she stood frozen, gun still in hand, her chest heaving with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Had she just won? The world felt as if it had tilted, the city's sounds muted, as though she were submerged underwater. The silence stretched on for a long moment. "Maria?" Williams called, his voice distant. She didn't respond. She couldn't. What had just happened? Was it him? She approached cautiously, keeping her weapon raised. Julian's body remained still, his chest barely rising. No, not again. Not like this. But then, with a sudden, harsh breath, Julian's eyes snapped open. For a moment, Maria thought she had imagined it. But then his lips curled into a grin, faint, but unmistakable. "I told you," he rasped, barely audible. "You'll never stop me." And with that, he fell silent again. The grin was the last thing Maria saw before he closed his eyes. And this time, there was no waking up. It was over. For real, Maria stood over Julian's still body, her heart pounding in her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but the shock, the disbelief, kept her frozen. The grin on his face, the one that lingered in her mind, haunted her in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. For a moment, the world felt distant, detached. She was still gripping her gun, her fingers numb from the tension, but she didn't lower it. Her mind raced. What had just happened? The silence was deafening now. The city, which had once felt like a chaotic, busy place, now seemed strangely hollow, like a vacuum that swallowed everything around her. Williams finally reached her, his footsteps echoing in the alley as he approached cautiously, eyes darting to the body before locking onto Maria. What the hell just happened?" he asked, his voice tight with confusion and concern. Maria didn't answer right away. She just stood there, staring down at Julian, trying to process what she had just witnessed. He was dead. He had to be. But that look in his eyes, how could someone so full of life, even in death, be so alive? "Maria?" Williams repeated, his voice shaking. "I don't," she started, her throat dry. She blinked hard, as though trying to clear her head, to make sense of the moment. But the words wouldn't come. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. It wasn't just Julian's grin. It wasn't just the fear that gnawed at her. It was something deeper, something colder. The world around her felt off kilter. Before she could say anything, a soft noise interrupted her. It was faint like a whisper, a crack in the stillness. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. Julian's hand twitched. Maria's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. No, this can't be." But it was happening. Julian's eyes fluttered open once again. This time, they weren't filled with the clarity of a man who had been to the brink and back. They were wild, frantic, but most chilling of all, they were empty. He let out a soft gasp, his body jerking as he slowly, painfully, began to push himself upright. "Stay down," Maria shouted, raising her gun again. But Julian wasn't listening. His body moved with an unnatural, jerky precision, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. His movements were wrong, awkward, lurching. "Maria?" Williams said, his voice low, cautious. "What the hell is happening?" The answer didn't come immediately. Maria's mind was reeling, the world spinning as Julian stood. He wasn't alive, he couldn't be. But something about him, something otherworldly, was crawling under her skin. Julian's mouth opened. His voice was guttural. "I told you," he rasped, his lips barely moving. "You can't end this. Not like this. I am the end." And with that, he lunged. It happened so fast. Maria barely had time to react. Before she knew it, Julian was on her, his body pressing against hers with a terrifying, unholy strength. His cold hands locked around her throat, and she felt a pressure that she hadn't experienced before. No human force, no grip so strong that it could choke the life out of her. She gasped for air, struggling to free herself from his grasp, but his fingers dug into her skin like claws. Her vision blurred. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, each thud growing more frantic, as if time itself were slowing down. "Maria?" Williams shouted, his voice distant. He lunged forward, but his hands couldn't reach her. Julian's fingers tightened. Her world began to close in around her, the edges of her vision darkening as she fought to stay conscious. Her thoughts began to scatter. Asterisk, this isn't possible. It can't be happening. He's already dead, asterisk. But it was happening. Julian was killing her. Again. Her hand scrambled for her gun, but it felt as though the weapon was miles away. She struggled harder, her chest tightening as the cold fingers slowly squeezed the life from her. Her body felt heavy, a lead weight pressing down on her chest. Then a sound, sharp, sudden, cut through the haze. A crack. Williams had fired. The gunshot echoed off the alley walls, deafening. But it didn't stop Julian. The pressure on Maria's throat only increased. Her vision was fading, everything growing dark. She could barely hear Williams shouting, his voice distant. But she didn't care anymore. There was nothing left for her to do except give in. This was it. But then a final shot rang out. This time it was different. It was like a thud, a wet, sickening thud. And then Julian's hands loosened. For the briefest moment, Maria felt the weight lift from her throat. She gasped, desperate for air, sucking it in greedily as her head swam. Another shot rang out, and then Julian collapsed, this time for good. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, his body twitching for a moment, before lying still. Maria fought to stay conscious, to keep her mind from slipping into unconsciousness. Williams was there, pulling her to her feet, his hands trembling. "Maria, are you okay? Are you hurt?" She didn't answer at first. Her throat burned, and she could still feel Julian's fingers digging into her skin, his cold touch lingering. She looked down at the body on the ground, and finally, she spoke, her voice hoarse. "It's over. He's gone." But deep down, something gnawed at her, a feeling that wouldn't let go. Because even as Julian lay dead, Maria knew one thing for certain. Asterisk, there was something more to this story. Something she hadn't yet uncovered, asterisk. And she was sure of one thing. Julian Hale wasn't the only monster out there. The nightmare wasn't truly finished. Not by a long shot. No one knew where he would strike next. The chill in the air was biting as Maria leaned against the brick wall, gasping for breath. Her skin felt cold, clammy from the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Williams stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her. But Maria wasn't really aware of him anymore. She was staring at the lifeless body of Julian Hale, sprawled on the pavement in an unnatural, twisted pose. It was hard to accept that he was truly gone, after everything, after all the manipulation, all the terror, and the terror that had consumed her every step. But there was something gnawing at her insides, a quiet, insistent voice that wouldn't let her rest. This isn't over. The words echoed in her mind like a broken record. Maria? Williams's voice was low, tentative. He reached out, but stopped when he saw the look in her eyes. You need to sit down. You're not. No. She cut him off, her voice hoarse but firm. We need to find out what the hell this is. Her gaze never left Julian's body. Something in her was still trying to process the impossibility of what had just happened. How a man who had been dead just minutes ago had risen again like a puppet on invisible strings, driven by a force beyond any reasonable explanation. She had seen death up close so many times, but never this. She turned to Williams, her face pale, but her eyes sharp, determined. There's something wrong with this. He didn't just die. He came back. We can't just let it go. Williams hesitated, glancing down at the body. What do you mean? We shot him, Maria. He's dead. It's over. Maria shook her head, a hollow laugh escaping her lips. No, it's not. Not yet. She turned away from him, walking back toward the alley entrance, the weight of her every step dragging her further into the abyss of uncertainty. Williams followed, his footsteps hesitant. Maria, we're not going to get answers standing out here. We need to get back to the precinct. We need to... No, she interrupted again, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the cold air. I need to see something. I need to check something. Check what? Williams was growing frustrated, his worry bleeding into his tone. Maria didn't answer right away. She was already heading toward the nearby streetlights, the faint hum of their lights buzzing in the eerie quiet of the night. She was thinking fast, piecing things together. Julian's obsession with Andrea, his twisted obsession with her, and how the more they learned, the deeper the darkness seemed to run. Her feet moved on their own as she rounded the corner. The nearby street was empty, save for the occasional car passing in the distance. It was almost peaceful, which made everything feel even more out of place. Then she stopped. There, beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, was a small, weathered journal. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She'd seen that journal before. It was Andrea's. How had it gotten here? Her pulse quickened as she bent down and picked it up, flipping it open to the first page. The writing was scrawled in hurried, frantic handwriting, words bleeding into one another. Maria felt a chill creep down her spine as she read the first entry aloud to herself. Asterisk, he's watching me. I can feel him everywhere. I don't know what he wants, but I'm scared. So scared. And I don't think I can run anymore. Asterisk. Maria felt her stomach turn. She flipped through the pages, reading more. Fragments of entries about Andrea's growing paranoia, her fear of being followed, of being trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. And then, towards the end, there was something new. A date. A date that matched the night she had died. The entry read, Asterisk, he's been planning this for months. I don't know how much time I have left. If you find this, don't look for him. Please. Asterisk. Maria's breath hitched. She quickly flipped to the final page, and the last words scrawled there made her freeze. Asterisk, it's not him. It's never been him. It's them. Asterisk. Maria's hands began to tremble as she reread those final words. Asterisk, it's not him. It's never been him. It's them. Asterisk. Who is Andrea talking about? Who were they? She felt a cold knot in her stomach as the realization slowly sank in. There had been more to Julian's obsession than she'd known. More to the game than he'd let on. She had thought that Julian was the cause, that he was the one pulling the strings, manipulating everyone. But this, the last entry, it didn't make sense. Was there a larger force behind all of this? And if so, where did it leave her now? William stepped up beside her, glancing at the journal in her hands. Maria, what is this? What's going on? She closed the book slowly, her mind reeling. She knew one thing for sure. The horrors they had uncovered so far were only the tip of the iceberg. The dark truth behind Andrea's murder, and now Julian's resurrection, was far deeper than she could have ever imagined. "It's not over, Williams," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "There's someone else behind this. Someone, or something, that's pulling the strings." Williams looked at her, his face pale, but Maria could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. He understood. He had to. But then, before they could speak further, a sudden noise from down the street interrupted them. An eerie, unnatural sound that made the hairs on the back of Maria's neck stand on end. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, a low, guttural moan. And then, from the darkness of the alleyway ahead, a figure emerged. It was Julian, or something that looked like him. The shadows were playing tricks on her, but there was no mistaking it. His body was moving, but this time it was wrong. The unnatural jerks and spasms, the vacant stare in his eyes. Maria knew, without a doubt, this wasn't the same man who had once haunted her. It was something else, and now it was coming for them. One that would come to light too late, that Maria's hand instinctively reached for her gun, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold steel of the weapon. But this time, she didn't raise it. She couldn't. What was in front of her wasn't the Julian Hale she had spent so many weeks trying to understand, trying to catch. No, this thing was different. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. Its eyes, empty, hollow, gazed at her, but there was no recognition in them. Only a haunting, relentless hunger. The dark figure shambled closer, its footsteps dragging across the pavement with an eerie rhythm. Every instinct screamed for Maria to run, to get away, but she couldn't look away. Williams was beside her now, his face pale and tight with fear, his hand clutching the gun at his side. "Maria, we need to leave. Now." But she didn't move. Not yet. She stared at Julian's, whatever this was, form as it slowly advanced, its hands twitching at its sides like a puppet struggling against its strings. The air between them felt charged with something unseen, a dark force hanging heavy, suffocating. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the thing that had once been Julian stopped. A rasping breath escaped its throat, unnatural and ragged. "Maria?" The voice was Julian's, but it was twisted, gurgling with something that made her skin crawl. "Maria," it repeated, the sound almost a growl now. "It's not over. You're next." Her breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words crashing down on her. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. And suddenly, she understood there had been something else all along. Something darker than Julian. Something that had kept him alive. Something that had been watching, waiting. Her heart raced as her mind spun. "Maria," the voice echoed once more, but this time there was something else in it. Asterisk familiar star. Before she could make sense of it, the figure moved again, its body jerking toward her, faster than before. Without thinking, Maria pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the alley, but it didn't stop him. The thing that had been Julian staggered, but didn't fall. It grinned, a sickening grin that twisted its face, and Maria's blood ran cold. "I told you," it rasped. "It was never me." And then, with a speed that defied logic, the figure lunged at her. Maria's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move, and in that instant, she realized the truth. She wasn't chasing a man anymore. She was chasing a monster, and it was already too late.